Good morning. This is Blaine's Whole webcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also listen in on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You get more information, listen to previous shows at our website, which is behind me, blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Sean Palmer, who's the new, or I guess relatively new, Executive Director at the YMI Cultural Center in downtown Asheville. Sean, you can wave to all your fans and friends who are watching this. Okay, so that is,
Hey y'all, how y'all doing?
well, very well. And again, a pleasure to have you on board. I should mention that Reverend Sean Palmer grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. He's an alumnus of uh, name of the college is
McAllister.
Macalester College, and
Hmm.
then earned an MA in African American Studies from Clark Atlanta University and
Hmm.
Master's of Divinity degree from Duke Divinity School. He has held leadership roles at Palmer College and Payne College, excuse me, and Duke University. Most recently, he serves as director of the award-winning Ubman African American Cultural Center at UNC Wilmington. Um, And so we're honored to have you here now in Asheville. So the question, Sean, let me ask you this question initially. As a kid, you grew up where?
I grew up in Columbia and Lexington, South Carolina.
Okay. And
So
when you were a kid growing up in Columbia and Lexington, the area, did you always know you wanted to be an executive director of a cultural center?
no, I wanted to be like most African American kids growing up in that time period. I wanted to be a doctor. I was trained by two educators. Was in what might have been what might we might call unofficial foster care, and raised by grandparents primarily, who really fostered my love and appreciation for the sciences and math. And my grandmother was an English teacher, which is how I fell in love with reading. But my love of African American studies and history really didn't hit until I was in high school and realized that we were not eating a strong diet of African American culture when I was at Lexington High School. And so I created the Black History Club, thinking that it was just something to do, and put up the Black History Month display, and it got torn down, and the N word was tossed on the display during one afternoon. We put it back up, and students supported, and some students supported it. And then when I went off to college, I realized that I did not know anything. I really hadn't learned enough. And so to supplement my classes in African American studies, or to supplement my biology and chemistry classes, I took African American studies classes and African American religious studies classes as ways to offset, because I thought they would be really good things for me to learn about. So I really back ended into my field. I really never thought that I would be doing this work, but I'm grateful that I am.
And you failed to tell the rest of the story also. Maybe it was a way to meet women, or just he doesn't tell that story, but you can impress people with the knowledge of a subject that I guess unfortunately they didn't know too much about. I guess what we said was so spot on though, because you said when you were a kid in school, and certainly when I was a kid in school, it's the same thing too. I knew very little about it, even to this day, because it was just never taught.
Yeah.
And around maybe around the era or whatever, but it's kind of interesting because all of a sudden this became something that kids should know about. But
Mm-hmm.
until I guess you came to that realization that you didn't know very much about it.
Yeah.
Was there anything, was it, you mentioned your grandmother or people who raised you or whatever, was there anybody who kind of sparked this interest?
Yeah, there were a few people. I would say I had really active grandparents in the community, and they were living Black history for sure. So call their names out, James and Thelma Hasker Payne. But my grandparents, or my family was a member of a church that was founded in 1865. And so my great great grandmother founded that church. And so my family has always been interested in genealogy, starting with our family reunions. And then my uncle and aunts really gave me my first kind of books on Black history one day, and were like, "You need to read this, and you need to read this, and you need to know more." And again, they haven't grown up in the civil rights movement, integrating schools, which was still a sore touchy point in the 80s and the 90s, because again, like they had to integrate schools where they were being, where they had to fight their classmates sometimes. And then being radicalized by the Black Power movement, my family would say that they were very intimately woven into Southern Black Power movement folks, and so they went that direction for a while, and then really latched on to kind of the Jesse Jackson movement. I can remember my mother having a Jesse Jackson political, like a T-shirt that said, Jesse Jackson in the 1980s for president. And so I think there were moments, but I would say that even though they wanted me to know my African American, wanted me to learn about African American history and heritage, I don't think it was ever their desire that I would take that and turn it into a career. In fact, they were worried when I came home during college and said, "I'm not going to med school. I'm not headed to law school. I'm actually headed to do a master's in African American studies." And they looked at me and said, "What you gonna do with that? We can't. We want you to be a doctor." And so there was a bit of a tug of war. And I think then they woke up one morning and found me in higher ed as an administrator, and then I went back to seminary, which I was scared to tell them about, but they were okay with it, partially because of the name recognition of the university. And then I thought I might do my PhD in African American Studies post, and then ended up working in what we call cultural centers, Black cultural centers, and I've had a 20-year career in that field.
And like you said, I can just imagine your parents, when you're, or the grandparents, that, yeah, who would have thunk that the child wasn't going to be the doctor or the lawyer or whatever, the professional, but in a field, which is ironic because you came along when the field was just kind of evolving. Like when I was
Yep.
a kid, nobody ever heard of the field, or when did the field actually become a field itself? When did it become popular that was an acceptable thing to study?
Yeah. Well, African American studies, it really comes into fruition in the 1960s as Black kids are um, integrating schools across the Midwest, Southwest, the Southeast, um, and heading off to college in larger fluxes. And so you get African American studies in San Francisco State being one of those things, but then the Black Cultural Center movement was another part of that movement. The cultural centers that I've worked in were started in the 80s and the 90s, some in protest, but mostly to honor where the university wanted to go in terms of being a place that was diverse and equitable. And so these two fields really were, I mean, when I was in school in the 90s, 94, 95, there was an unearthing and a resurgence of like Black literature. And so many ways, I think that the field really sees itself grow in the late 80s, early 90s, early into the 2000s, and really becomes one of the catalysts for many of the political and social movements that we see in happening now, from Black Lives Matter to to some of the other movements that really try to seek to diversify issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality. My family was fine with that. They thought that was great, but they thought that was somebody else's kid because there was a luxury to doing that kind of work in their mind. And so when I decided to go my own path, I think as Black families tend to do, they tend to rest their hopes and dreams on one child. I think I had to undo that for them and undo it for me, and then create a pathway. Because I came from primarily working class and underclass folks, they just did not have an understanding of the galaxy that could exist in cultural center movements and in Black history and in Black culture and preservation. And so I think, in many ways, we are African Americans are very similar to to our diaspora brothers and sisters who kind of see 3 or 4 pathways as legitimate, right? Education was one, but not so much in this moment because of the way in which we don't really center education. But doctors, lawyers, businessmen are find careers. Engineers are finding careers in a lot of Black homes. And pastoral, religious careers if necessary and if God is calling, because we believe in a God consciousness that says, we honor what God is doing. But I think beyond that, like, if you're not in one of those major professions, Black folks, particularly working class Black folks who have not seen the variety of possibilities, really struggle with supporting their children through preservation or other kinds of fields that we don't know and have access to.
My concern, Sean, and I didn't want to become a political show per se, but
Mm-hmm.
my concern is any of this in danger? I won't mention any president's name or any political
Yeah.
party, but my concern is that being challenged at all? In
Oh,
terms of
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would argue so we're in a pendulum swing, and we've been in a pendulum swing since the Obama era.
right,
Um, that pendulum swing went from hope, and during COVID, we had a lot of support for multicultural, multi-ethnic initiatives. And so cultural centers as like YMI, while we are the oldest Black cultural center in the country, cultural centers were developing in places like North Dakota and Montana and Iowa. So we see cultural centers in those places. There are over 100, there are at least 170 plus cultural centers in the country. Um, and then once legislations began using terms like where woke comes to
right,
die,
right.
we saw demolition of Black cultural centers and multicultural centers in Florida specifically, then Texas, then Ohio. And then in North Carolina, what they did, instead of going through the legislature, they went through the Board of Governors and began to dismantle some of these efforts. And a lot of it was, I mean, and one of the legislation around it was very unclear. So every school did something different. Some schools refused to let go of their centers. So places like Chapel Hill and North Carolina State, Duke, and then other schools got rid of everything. So schools that were rich in Black students and Latinx students like UNC Charlotte decided to demolition everything. And UNCW wanted to create a much smaller pathway. So they decided to do a multicultural center, dissolve most of the staff's positions, and move forward as though not everything was okay. And again, like, some of us have been in the, cultural center work has existed for at least 40 years, 40 to 50 years. Um, so it was a shock. And then, but right now there seems to be, as our current political system has swung to the other side, and there are executive orders to dismantle cultural centers, particularly in university and college settings where many of them reside. Um, Universities have had to fight back.
I'm
And
listening to
so our
you.
states have fought back. So some folks are fighting back from those, and they are they realize, what do you do with a cultural center that has a 75-year history and a $1.5 million art collection? Why would you get rid of that as an asset, right? So there are cultural centers around the country that really make it possible for, they do everything from recruiting to supporting athletics to supporting a university community. Cultural centers like mine, or like Hayti, or like the Syracuse Folk Center. We make sure that there are places for artists and poetry and light and sound and soul for communities. And so these places are really important in the galaxy of community development and leadership, and really how we center diverse stories in our worlds, in all of our worlds.
Well, listening to you, it wasn't your intent, but I'm kind of getting pissed listening to you, not at you, but just this process, because what you just said was just incredible. Not just YMI, but throughout the country, we had all these cultural centers. All of a sudden, and the upsetting thing to me, Sean, is the rapidity of it, the quickness of it, that
Yeah.
what, everything's going fine. So Obama years, whatever, call it what you want. And all of a sudden, tomorrow we're going to have much less of this out there, just like overnight, just scary. But you said something else interesting. Let's come back to that. Is that, yeah, I kind of knew, but I'll ask you to trace the history of it. YMI, that's pretty cool. So Asheville had the oldest center in the country.
We are the oldest center in the nation, and it's not. We
We are,
are the
sorry.
oldest center in the nation.
Wow. So talk me, so I don't know the history of it, just kind of the Reader's Digest version of the history. It started, when did it start?
So we started in the 1890s, 92 and 93, in support with support from the Vanderbilt family, as two African American men in the area. One who was brought here by Vanderbilt to educate the sons and daughters of recently freed Africans, um, and the other one was a multiracial child of the Appalachian corridor, right? And so they go and they say, we need some space to grow this community, since you need this community to do artisan work, and we need this community, and we are building a community. And they have no place to lay their heads at night, because most things are still observing a whites only space. We hadn't reached Jim Crow yet, but we are in the Gilded Age, right? And so we're right before the end of the start of Jim Crow. So YMI is older than the NAACP. YMI is older than the Urban League. YMI is older than most HBCUs. YMI is older than most Black fraternities and sororities. And so are all of our Black fraternities and sororities. And so it was this organization that was a community galvanizing organization, a place for rest, a place to begin your economic development, a place to find a church home, a place to be educated in. Even though it wasn't a school, it did have school functioning, had a daycare functioning in it at one point in time. And for many generations, it has done different things, but it has been a consistent part of the development of the what we might call Asheville and the surrounding mountainous communities. But it is a guiding hope and light in our country as a national treasure.
Now, when you're talking in YMI, I should know it, but I'll ask you. So the acronym stands for what, or why?
So originally the acronym stood for Young Men's Institute, because it
Okay,
was similar to YMCA, right?
right.
But the YMCA at the time would not allow African Americans to participate in it, so they named it YMI. So very similar. Um, at some point in the history, YMCA actually takes over the YMI, and the YMCA is actually in the YMI. And there was a pool and basketball courts during that period of time. And then the YMCA builds out its own buildings in Asheville and kind of leaves the YMI in disrepair, as just as we're heading towards urban renewal, gentrification, redlining, as we're moving into that era, and kind of like on the precipice of the crack epidemic and those areas of drugs being pushed into Black communities. And so 8 to 9 pastors and their churches band together to pay off the YMI, to buy the YMI back, or right before it goes off to be sold. And then they keep the initials as a reminder that this space has a huge legacy of always doing the cultural center work, but they just use the initials instead of using the original name. So the initials once stood for Young Men's Institute. They are just stand-ins for the history of the space in this current iteration.
It's funny because a lot of organizations have done that. If you know,
Yeah,
like
YWCA is one of them.
SCORE, AR, a lot of other groups have just keep the initials. So that, thanks for sharing that. So it's YMI is just the name of the organization overall, not standing specifically. But talk also, Sean, if you would, and I guess you picked up the history. So the history of blacks in Africa in Asheville was kind of it was a very splinter time, I guess, when they had integration, when schools got integrated. And then a lot of people still talk about it, that it took a vibrant community and kind of segregated it in some respects, right? Or the whole idea that um, you can have blacks used to be right all over Asheville, and then they kind of went into one area. Am I expressing it correctly?
Yeah, I mean, the story of African American integration, and again, I'm continuing to learn, but as a preservationist and
Right.
as somebody who has studied African American studies, There are some contours that are very similar to other parts of the state and other parts of the country. But what we know is that African Americans came to this region looking for freedom. And we know that we had pockets of maroon societies that were in Stomptown and
Right.
created that were Gullah Geechee descendants. And then we knew that there were artisans that moved to the area to help to build the Vanderbilt. And because they came with skills, they built out Black Wall Street, right? And in the Gilded Age, you get a number of African Americans moving to the region to create their own Black pinnacle of success. And that looks like Black doctors and lawyers and educators. And that really is the centerpiece. I mean, you have a thriving Black community in Asheville through the late 60s. And then after the burning of Stevens Lee High School, which was supporting not just Ashevilleans,
Right.
but also everywhere from Black Mountain to Swannanoa, like a number of Black communities were coming to school because it was the only school in I think a 50-mile radius is what I understand. And so when that community, when they demolitioned the high school and really segregated education, many of those educators were left without jobs. And what that means in a region that is like ours is that they moved other places and they migrated to other parts of the state or other parts of the country where they could work. And that had already happened with one of our founders of the center. He was not here long. He was only here for 4 years, and his indelible impact creates the YMI in the 1800s. But others follow along. I mean, these Black middle class folks get pushed out of the community, and that's first one piece. And then the second piece is then this urban renewal project hits, which hits our area just like it hits other areas, and they're calling them different things. One is, I think the easiest way to think about it is a certain level of redlining in Black communities, like just moving highways and things into Black communities and going past using the highway to build over the Black community, so the community is split into two sides, and Black folks not really understanding or are not having any say so and advocacy in the matter. And so that breaks up the communities, and then that pushes some people out because it lowers their property value. It means that they don't have property because it's just been turned into the eminent domain. And then Black folks, as the city becomes or the area becomes a hotspot for travel and destination, and as folks have just recently published trust funds, which I find hilarious, that this becomes kind of a northern, this becomes a place where folks want to cosplay mountaineer behavior. And so as they raise the rents on things, it pushes Black people further out. So further down the mountain, further down into Charlotte, further down into Spartanburg, further into Atlanta and Columbia. And so those things happen. And so we go from 14% of a community that was up 20 to 25%, 14%. That is now about 4% of the population in the community that we live in. So there are approximately 14,000 people of African descent living in Asheville.
And by the way, that figure is still surprising to me because years ago it was even higher. So even that's dropping down from
Yep.
what it's been fairly recently. And so let's kind of fast forward this then, Sean, back to the YMI. So long time history, but then also until you came, I won't say until you came, but kind of also a checkered past because for a lot of years, unfortunately, I always knew the YMI and it was the cultural center, but it had some growing pains, I guess. Well, not growing pains, had some troubles. I guess I've been here since 2008, but ever since I've been here, it's
Mhm.
gone through a series of changes, but not necessarily for the better. It was once a flourishing center, and
Mhm.
hopefully under your leadership it'll be flourishing again. But what kind of happened then over the last 10, 20 years to the center and where you are now?
Yeah, I think there are some really good things to pick up on. I think our newspaper that covers multicultural journalism wrote an article, I would almost say at least 10 or 15 years ago, about what the storied past of the YMI. For sure, when I've done just a preliminary historical analysis, and just learning, just looking back. Um, we learned that about every 30 to 40 years, the YMI falls into disrepair and needs a number of support and to develop. And so each generation gets a healthy YMI, and then there's a generation that doesn't get a YMI at all, or a YMI that is in disrepair and fractured. And I think, like all Black organizations, I mean, we're at the mercy of systems and powers and principalities, if I use the language of the church, that support and develop or hinder our development. And so the YMI comes out of the genius of Black excellence, but it is not just Black excellence that supports it, right? The YMI is an 18,000 square foot building that has had to reinvent itself almost every 40 years. And so when we think about like what's transpired over the last 20 years, I mean, there's from board development to needing somebody who has a specialized set of skills that we can't just find anywhere, right? Like you can't just find a YMI director in the community. And we've written about this in the Association for Black Cultural Centers, like approach to this, because you really need somebody who has both the education to run a cultural center. I mean, in terms of like just knowing the history of things in America and understanding what they're holding on to. And you also need somebody who is dynamic and a fundraiser. And those people aren't cheap. They aren't free, and they don't work like they are preservationists, and their work is significant, and it is as the word that I want to use it has as much specificity as engineering degrees, right? You're not just a chemical engineer, you're not just an electrical engineer, but you're an electrical engineer for something, for a specific thing. And that is the kind of skill set you need to run a cultural center. You need somebody who can do the business work or have access to the business work and do those things. And I think in many ways that the cultural center, as I understand it, and as I know it to be, has been working from a deficit of need.
I was going to say, by the way, this is unfortunately for you, I guess is, but unfortunately, that's my perception of where you are coming into the play. In other words, that YMI has been around a long time, but it seems in the back of my mind there have been several executive directors, several board changes, several. It hasn't been an organization that had a lot of people staying in it for long periods of time. It seemed to be in a state
Right.
of flux. Would that be a way to describe it up until now when you're on board?
I think the flux comes from like the work can easily burn you out. Like,
Right,
and no, and I don't imagine any board chair would stay longer than 5 or 6 years. 4 years is a long time on a board.
right.
It's a long time as a director. I mean, we don't live in a world where folks stay at any job for more than 5 to 6 years. I mean, there used to be a suggestion that when you worked, like, let's think about college presidents for just a second, right? The average college president tenure is like between 5 and 7.5 years. We are just watching the Smithsonian, their director of the museum at the Smithsonian for the International African American Museum. No, not the International African American, the Smithsonian Museum, the African American Smithsonian. He just stepped down, right, because of the peril of the time that we live in. And I think that cultural centers are probably canaries in the mine around what the political agency of the time is like. And it takes a lot of money to run these things, right? Like these are not, you know, these are not cheaply run if you want a well done one. And it requires the benevolence of a community. It requires the benevolence of a nation. It requires really good fundraising. It requires that the city and state agree that you're not going to leave something to almost die before you step in. And community members, same with community members. I think um, I think the YMI has a beautiful future ahead of it. We've done a renovation of our building. We are getting ready to do a renovation of our board because it's time for folks to roll off because they have done their good work, and so they need time to rest and just to benefit from the space. And we're working on a renovation of the staff. And for me, finding staff to run the YMI means I have to find people who I have to do a nationwide search and find folks who are both committed to the education of the space, but who also are competent and capable of doing the work because they know other spaces. Um, and again, like what we are running into at our cultural center are the same kinds of issues and concerns that almost every cultural center in the nation runs into.
And since you mentioned Sean, let me talk a little bit about that process. So if anybody's listening or going to watch the show after the fact, um, if they want to get involved in the YMI, how do they do
Yeah,
that?
several ways. If you want to volunteer, you can easily email us at info@YMI Cultural Center. It will go to my email directly, and then I will send it over to our community engagement staff member to help correlate, to help get together a number of folks to
By the way,
become
let me just check what you said. So what the email again? What's the end? Is it edu or com or what is it?
org.org.
.org. I'm sorry. So
Yep,
it's
and it's found on our website. Our website is up to date.
okay.
Easiest way to figure out what we're up to is to go to our website and to send us your information so that we can log you into one of our databases.
And the
That's
website is what?
YMI culturalcenter.org.
Okay. And so that is all the information on volunteering, getting involved.
All of that. Yep.
So you're looking for
Easy to donate.
you're
Hmm?
looking for people to volunteer. And we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we need
And
we need
also
volunteers
in
regularly.
fundraising, if they want to contribute, they can also contribute.
Yes, and
Okay.
we're looking for sponsors for Goombay as we speak. So if you just got a smooth $10,000 laying around and you want to put it towards arts and music and culture, then we would love to be a part of your sponsorship package. We've had folks donate stocks to us and bonds and things like that. We've had folks donate artifacts to us, so we do take a repository of artifacts and keep it in our archive. So those things get rotated out into our museum quite a bit. We have a few jobs opening, so there are some jobs available, and so we're getting ready to inaugurate a workforce program, and so we have people. If you want to be involved in working in our workforce program or participating in our workforce program, go back to our website regularly, or our Instagram and social media, because we keep those up to date. And then again, like even a $15, $20, $25 donation makes a huge dent in our operations and development, as we continue to develop, around making sure that we are doing good work around the arts and raising attention around African Americans and Afro diasporic folks in the Appalachian region, which we call Afro-Latin, as you hear me
I know.
using it.
Well,
Um,
let me just jump in here a second, Sean. So you mentioned a couple of things, but one of them is that you mentioned a festival, and just like you mentioned that festival again too, because that also hasn't always taken place, or it was on hold for a year or two. The big
yeah.
African festival,
So yeah, the festival, Goombay Festival, was supposed to restart last year
right?
during Helene, and so it had to be moved again. It was not our intention to move it, but we had no choice, because the city was needed us to pivot and turn into an emergency center for all of the different things that were happening in our city, and we wanted to make sure that we were there. Plus, there was no I had not started yet, and we didn't have most of our professional staff was not here. So our board has done a yeoman's job of being a working board, like keeping the lights on, going to meetings and all of that kind of stuff. And we're still technically under our renovation. We still have a few things left in our renovation project. So that $6 million renovation started in COVID, but it wasn't done. It wasn't finished until after COVID. And so right as Helene is hitting, we were almost at the finish line for our project. And so again, those things took precedent over Goombay, unfortunately. But we do plan to bring Goombay back. We've already settled on date September 5th through the 9th for Goombay. Information is up on our website about Goombay. As we continue to design a robust set of program initiatives that really seek to highlight the region and highlight Afro-Latin culture.
And lastly, you mentioned two other events to me off the air. The one is
Yeah,
coming, I think that you have a festival you're hosting, which is kind of exciting, the Improv Festival. Talk a little bit
yep.
about that.
So Improv Festival is Mother's Day weekend. We are part of one of the hosts for the Improv Festival. We'll be hosting the last night and the after party, and so we invite folks to. You can go to our website and buy tickets for 40. I think they're $40 a piece if you would like to participate in that. And then as we move towards Juneteenth, we will be hosting a virtual 5K, which means you can run in your own neighborhood and get a T-shirt. We'll send a T-shirt to your house and you can run with your friends and sponsor, put a little sponsorship money together and send your love donations over to YMI. Or you can come downtown and run with us or walk with us around our particular area and see kind of the scenic view of the city as we participate in the 5K that will lead into what we call our Ajima Health Series health initiative, which is a health fair really meant to support folks in making sure that their diabetes is under control, meeting doctors, getting healthy eating, doing aerobics, learning about our fitness programs in the building, but also getting the support you need to make a healthy choice in the middle of the year as we hit the 6 month period known as Juneteenth.
And I should ask you then, the last thing you mentioned the race coming up. So if somebody does that on their own, the virtual thing, do they have to do it within a certain period of time, or can they take as long as they want?
They can take as long as they want, but they got to do it within the week. You can
Oh,
register now, and then you do it during the week. And it's a little bit like golf. We want you to tell your truth. So you cannot. We want you to start. Time yourself. You can put your time and entry on our website. You can choose your own team. You can do it with a few other people. You can register a group, and you can do it around your neighborhood if you live in South Asheville or West Asheville and you don't want to necessarily come down the street on the same day or you're out of town. Or if you know that others who love YMI and you want to do it with your family members who live around the country, we invite you to participate in that way as well. So there are a number of ways to get involved as we seek to raise resources for operations and fitness development and programming and arts programming as well.
okay, exciting event. Sean Palmer, I'd like you to just one more time repeat the website if folks want to get information.
www.ymiculturalcenter.org.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for being my guest on this edition of the Blaine's World show. Hopefully, sometime in the future, not too far distant, we'll actually get to meet in person. And thanks for all you're doing in Nashville. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Blaine. I appreciate you for inviting me to the show, and you're always welcome to come and be a part of any of the things that we're doing at the YMI, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, we'll take you up on it. Also, I thank my producer, Cappy Dissetti, and appreciate the offer. We'll keep that in mind, buddy. Thanks a lot.
All right, take care.